When it comes to the Apple II, there were a number of imitators and clones. We've covered a lot of them here on Vintage Geek, but today we're covering one of the weirdest. This is the Albert, and this is Vintage Geek. Just a reminder, if you're into vintage technology and computers like the Albert here, be sure to like and subscribe. It's going to help us a lot as we grow, and I also encourage you to become a member at the website vintagegeek.com. Back in the early 80s, the Apple II was one of the strongest personal computers available on the market, and it was becoming very popular. A lot of companies were in a rush to put out a clone computer that could do the same things as the Apple II at a lower price point, and some companies were trying to get an Apple II clone that could do better than the original, and that's where the Albert comes in. The Albert Computer Company was based in Thousand Oaks, California. Some of the things that they were shooting for with the Albert model was having built-in serial communications, for example. They wanted to have built-in RS-422, which could be used to connect to other Apple IIs or Albert computers in this case. They wanted to have built-in printer functionality, so you didn't have to have an external card to connect to a printer, which was one of the limitations of the original Apple II. And they wanted to have onboard sound capabilities right out of the box, so you could have digitized sound, voice commands, and things like that. Plus, they wanted to have some better base specs, a little bit more memory right out of the gate, and they wanted to have the floppy drives included, and they had an interesting take on the design of the unit itself. Now, when we talked about the Unitron and of course the Laser 128, you could see the similarities in design between those systems and the original Apple II. In the case of the Albert computer, they called their design stereo styling because they used multiple chassis to contain the different components of the system. We acquired an Albert computer some time ago here at the Vintage Geek Museum. Today, we're going to take a look at each component, see what's inside, and then maybe at the end we'll try to power it up if we have enough cables and connectors to make that happen. But I'm excited to dig into the Albert here on Vintage Geek. Let's take a look first at the Albert keyboard. One thing I noticed right away is that it's beefy. This one's made out of metal, which is uncommon for the Apple II clones. Of course, having the keyboard separate in itself is also unique. This was not the case with the other Apple IIs and clones. And it looks like this connects to the system using a single modular cable. Looking at the keys themselves, they don't have a bad feel to them. They're not clicky by any means, but there's a good range of motion to each key. The design of the keyboard and layout is pretty standard. All of the letter keys are in the normal place. You've got a return key where I would expect it to be. You've got a function key that I did not expect to see. I don't remember that being in the original Apple design. And you have a physical caps lock, tab key, and there's 5 function keys to the right-hand side of the keyboard. The Apple II did not have those either, so I'm not sure what those are designed for. You've got the left and right arrows up here on this part of the keyboard, and I don't see the up and down arrows. As I remember on the Apple II, they were all kind of in a row at the bottom right-hand side, but I actually don't see the up and down arrows at all, so I'm curious as to how to do those functions. I wanted to quickly take apart the keyboard chassis just to see what's inside this unit. There's just a single plate on the bottom. It's easy to take off. There is the underlying board that contains all of the keys itself was made by SMK. There's an identifier on the board that says it's a JM9031-02. However, Albert Computers did make the daughter board that's on top that connects to it and provides the interface to the modular jack on the back of the chassis. It also looks like there's a kind of homemade wire going from that interface board to ground via a resistor. There's not a lot of info online on this particular computer, so I don't know what's standard and what's not. This is the Albert Computer drive cage chassis. This unit actually has 2 5 1/4 half-height disk drives in it. They do have stickers on the front of each drive that says Super 5, and the chassis itself has the Albert branding to the one side of it. It's a good-looking design overall. There are a couple of ribbon cables that are coming out of the unit. It looks like these cables are going to actually drape down into the main chassis and then plug into the interface card. But there's not much to talk about in this one externally other than the front face. There is no power connector per se coming out of the unit, so it must be getting everything from the drive interface card, which I suppose makes sense. That would be similar to the Apple II configuration that we have with our normal systems here in the museum. Taking a look inside the Albert drive cage chassis, I see that there are the 2 5 1/4 inch drives. Taking one of them out of the mounting bracket, I found that they are made by Alps out of Japan. Both the drives are identical. I don't see any kind of jumpers or dip switches or anything on these that would determine drive order or anything like that. But on this particular drive, there actually is one sticker that looks to be handwritten, and it either has -2 or -2 on it. I assume that has to do with drive order, probably with the person that was assembling the chassis just to know which one was which, although that seems like it would be something that would be fairly obvious just based on the physical placement. So I'm not really sure why they put the 2 on it, but for me, it just means that it's drive 2, and I'm going to go with that. Each one of the drives has its individual ribbon cable that I assume goes to the interface card, and there are 2 cutout holes in the bottom of the chassis that perfectly fit each one of those cables. Strangely, as we'll cover in a minute, the actual CPU chassis only has one of those access holes coming in from the top, so I'm not sure why they did the two-hole design in this chassis versus the other one, but there's probably some reasoning in that somewhere along the way. The one cable is physically longer than the other, which I assume will give it a better ability to plug into the interface card where they're probably side by side. These drives look like they're in fairly good shape. I don't see anything that would be an immediate red flag here, and I guess it's time to take a look now at the main chassis. I do like the Albert design and kind of the two-tone coloring and the Albert logo, and again, this whole thing is made out of metal. It's a beefy construction. Starting at the front panel, at the left-hand side, we've got the modular connector that's going to connect this unit to the external keyboard. We've got a 3-element LED on the right-hand side here that's for status. One of the interesting features that they could include was a battery backup system. This was not something that was common at the time. Of course, now we have uninterruptible power supplies all over the place, but that was probably one of their better features. It looks like this status indicator would show you the level of charge in the battery system. Moving over further to the right, we've got the power button. Then we have a charge button. Obviously, it's part of the battery backup system. Maybe that puts it into a charge mode rather than the computer operating. We have a reset button, and then we have the status on indicator on the far right-hand side. Looking at the back panel of the Albert, I did notice that there are a few holes in the back cover. Now, I'm not sure if those were for extra DB type connectors for additional peripherals. Ours are currently empty, so not much going on there. Moving from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, we start out with a group of 4 connectors. There's a separate port for DC as well as an external battery. So I guess that you could actually power the system off of raw DC, probably 12 volts, as well as having the battery connected for external backup purposes. I'm glad in this case that they decided to use an external battery rather than putting one inside the chassis, because as we've seen in other systems, the internal batteries created catastrophes over the years as batteries leaked and ultimately created a lot of damage to motherboards. So good choice on that one, Albert Computer Company. After that, we've got the external speaker and microphone connectors. Now, from what I've read, these are not the same as the standard audio in and out for the cassette that you would see on the Apple II. I believe this actually does have digitized sound capabilities, and it also seemed to indicate that there was some kind of voice control available with this system. In the next section, we have our video connectors. There's a composite video out, which is a standard RCA connector. Next over, there's an RGB connector. This was another unique feature for the Albert. They did offer RGB video, and from what I've read, up to 256 colors in the palette, which was more than you could get with the Apple II. After that, you've got an analog conversion port. I believe that is for the joystick or other analog devices. And following that, you've got the RS422 port. This was one of those other unique features. They were looking to connect the Albert to other Albert systems or even possibly to other Apples. Following that, you've got your RS232 for serial communications. They were pretty proud of this and the fact that the system had RS232 right out of the box. You didn't have to buy an external interface card for that feature. And finally, you have the parallel port, which is a different style connector, but they were also very pleased with the fact that you could interface just about any printer. You didn't need a separate interface card to do so. These were all kind of the integrated features that Albert was really promoting, and their whole tagline ended up being, "Is the Albert smarter than the Apple? We think it is," which ultimately got them sued, from what I understand, by Apple. I'm not sure how that all turned out in court, but given the fact that the Albert company is no longer around, well, maybe that's why. Taking a look inside our Albert computer, the motherboard that we have here is labeled as a Rev C. Now, I don't know how many different revs there were of the Albert main board, but we have the 3rd incarnation apparently here today. One thing I noticed right away is that there is no AC power input into the system. It looks like Albert was intending on having an external power supply at all times for this unit, or you could use it off of raw DC, but it does not have the internal 110 volt AC supply that you would normally see in an Apple II. There is a DC regulated supply on the side of the chassis here. Not sure of the status of the electrolytic capacitors on it, but overall doesn't look too bad. Looking at the motherboard itself, there's some other kind of weird things going on here. One thing that's interesting to me is that Albert decided to make the expansion slots on the motherboard go side to side instead of front to back. This was different than the standard Apple design, which actually had the front to back expansion slots. It's just not something that I've seen in the past. This device does have the 6502 processor chip in it, and there are a couple of headers on each side of that processor that I assume you could use for diagnostics purposes, perhaps. Maybe there was some kind of a plug-in module that could do some testing on the CPU. I'm hoping that someone out there is an expert on Albert computers, because there just isn't a lot of info out there on the system. It's a clean design overall. The board itself does look to be fully populated. Every socket is filled, and it does look like the majority of the chips are socketed, so if we run into problems, it should be pretty easy to swap something out if we can find the ICs to actually replace them with. So a pretty positive outlook on the Albert computer so far. far. Things don't look too bad inside. It's fairly clean. There's not a lot of dirt and dust inside this unit. I think there's a good probability this thing could come to life once we get the right power supply for it and the right cable for the keyboard. There's a good chance that we can make something work. Finally, with our Albert computer, we did receive one peripheral card with the system, and that is the Albert Computer Diagnostic Disk Controller. Now, looking at this card, it seems like the normal Apple II disk controller card. It looks very similar in design. I'm a little bit confused as to why it's called the Diagnostic Disk Controller. Are there other functions on this card that would allow you to do tests on the drives themselves? Again, not really any information that I can find online about the system, so would welcome your comments below. There are two header connectors on this that I assume go to the two drives. We saw the ribbon cables coming out of the drive cage, and now seeing the orientation of those slots inside of the main chassis, it makes a little bit more sense to me why there's only one hole on the top of the Albert CPU, because that would have been the side that these cards would reside in. They would all plug in on the right-hand side of the chassis. Looking at it from behind, you would string the ribbon cables in to that one access point, and then it would connect to both of the header connectors on the card. And because the one drive cable is longer than the other, there's probably enough slack to get both of those to work. I'm anxious to get into the Albert to see what it can do as far as actually operating as a computer. We're not quite there yet today. We're going to need to make sure that we know the right power supply to use for the system. I assume that it's 12 volt based on everything that I've read online, but because there's no actual indication on the system as to the voltage it's expecting, I don't want to just put something random into it and risk blowing something up. So I'm going to do a little bit more research on that and see what kind of power supply we need to fire this unit up. We should also do a little bit of checking on that cable for the keyboard just to make sure it's something standard. But everything is here. I don't see anything missing, and I don't see any components that look damaged. Everything's pretty clean, so I'm pretty confident that this Albert will power up at some point, and I'm anxious to share that with all of you here on the channel when we get to that point. And if you're into this kind of thing, vintage technology, some of these rare and obscure computers, I would encourage you to like and subscribe. It helps us a lot as we grow here at Vintage Geek and the museum. And I would encourage you to become a Vintage Geek member. You can do that on the website at vintagegeek.com. We've got extra video content, extra code snippets. There's a forum where you can discuss a lot of our video content. It's a lot of fun. Go to vintagegeek.com. Until next time, I'm Aaron, and this has been Vintage Geek.